This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, good evening, dear brothers and sisters. How are you? Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and we are continuing our discussion of the newly released book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, which I hope you will get a copy of, because I think you'll find it very interesting. It's only been out for about a week, and I'm getting some nice comments so far, it's very encouraging. I really appreciate hearing from people, answering questions that you didn't even know you had. We have been going through the Passion of Christ, talking about various issues related to the Passion of Christ, and we have arrived at the point, because he's been condemned by the Jewish leaders. That's what we talked about last time, the Jewish trial. And now we have reached the point where he's going to be brought before the Roman authorities. And why is that? Because they wanted Jesus to be discredited. It wasn't enough that he be out of the way, gone. The Jewish authorities really wanted Jesus to suffer a loss of his reputation, because the people considered him to be a prophet, if not the Messiah, certainly at least a prophet. And without him dying by crucifixion, he would still have been highly regarded. So they wanted him to lose status, to become discredited, as I said. They wanted proof that Jesus was a false prophet, that he was cursed by God, and the only way to accomplish that was to kill him, or have him be killed by the Romans by crucifixion, because nothing was considered worse than crucifixion. No death, I think, ever recorded has been considered worse than crucifixion. So because he died by crucifixion, it would be considered proof that God had cursed him, because in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. And crucifixion, excuse me, had become regarded as a form of hanging. So even though it doesn't make sense to us, because we think of hanging as, like by a rope around your neck, but crucifixion was categorized as a type of hanging. And so it was considered proof that somebody was cursed by God. So it wasn't enough simply to eliminate Jesus, simply to kill him, but to make sure that everybody got the message that he was wrong in the things that he taught and the things that he did, and that he was a false prophet because of the manner of his death. The other benefit of having Jesus get crucified by the Romans is that the Jewish authorities could distance themselves from any responsibility for his death. So that was also a benefit. But nothing topped the benefit of having him die by crucifixion, because of what that said about who he was. So before we get into a little bit more about the actual person of Pontius Pilate, I'm going to read to you email I received from Nick from Rochester, New York. And he thought he was asking me one question, but I think there's at least 7 questions here. But it has to do with some of the issues that we will be discussing over the next couple of weeks. I wonder if you could share from that standpoint an opinion on the laws regarding crucifixion, specifically the likelihood of Joseph of Arimathea being able to obtain the body of Jesus on petition to Pilate. Well, we'll talk about that when we get to the burial. My understanding is that unlike Roman civil law, criminal law was more local and specifics of enforcement were at the discretion of the governor. Is that right? Well, so Roman civil law and criminal law are very different. That's for sure. So I'm answering parts of Nick's question, and I'm going to explain to you how I know what I know about Roman law. When I was a student at Harvard Divinity School, because I was an advanced New Testament student, they have a special class that meets once a week called the Upper Seminar. Well, I said they had. I don't know if they still have it. But it was called the Upper New Testament Seminar, and all the advanced New Testament students belonged to this class. And the class met once a week, and all the New Testament professors of Harvard were there, along with the students, and we would read somebody's paper and we would discuss it. So everybody in the class had to write a research paper and talk about it. So then they gave a copy to everyone in the class, and everyone read it before the class meeting, and they talked about it. My paper was about criminal trial procedures in the Roman Empire in the 1st century in the provinces. That I didn't say that right. Roman criminal trial procedure in the provinces during the 1st century. So I did a lot of work on this. Mine was actually the last one. It was at the end of the semester, and it was 50 pages long, single spaced. Everybody else gave like 15-page, 20-page papers. Mine was really long, and I didn't even answer everything I wanted to answer. I just amassed so much information. I went to Harvard Law Library, and also to the Widener Library, which is the main library of Harvard University. But the law library also had books on Roman law, and I immersed myself in the study of Roman law, and there was a lot to learn. Our law in this country is based on English common law, which is an entirely different system. So even though we think of Roman law as something, very advanced, it was actually, I found it quite brutal and primitive, to tell you the truth. But of course, I'm speaking as a modern person. But it was an entirely different way of structuring law. This kind of paper could not have been read or written by a person who wasn't already a lawyer. Since I was a lawyer, at least I understood the parameters and the discussions and the issues involved. That was a tremendous benefit. So, but I had to really start at the beginning. I had to learn about the 12 tables, and this is the foundations of Roman law. I had to go back to when Rome was a kingdom to be able to understand the structure of their legal system. So to answer next question, Roman civil law, criminal law was more local, and specifics of enforcement were at the discretion of the governor. No, Roman criminal law differs from what they called the civil law, in that Roman criminal law was actually very narrow, and many laws that we would consider, or many offenses, many actions that today we would consider a crime, were not a crime under Roman law. It has nothing to do with it being local. They called those things a delict. So criminal law was pretty narrow. In other words, when we say narrow in the law, means there wasn't a lot of it. The Romans were more interested in civil law, and they had a fantastic interest in property and inheritance and laws concerning adoption and inheritance, anything having to do with possessions. It was very interesting. That aspect of Roman law I didn't study at all. Adoption and property and the inheritance of property, that was a whole different field. I never got into that at all because I wasn't interested in it. So what we would call civil law, many things that today we would not, civil law for us today is anything that's not criminal law, and it's not something that arises out of a contract. So if you violate a contract, then that operates according to contract law. You're suing under the contract, the provisions of the contract. So civil law is an accident. Somebody's negligent, they hit your car, or you slip and fall because the pavement was, or you trip because the pavement was uneven, or things like that. That's, in other words, an injury that results that doesn't have to do with contract. Somebody didn't injure you because they didn't come through with a contract. Criminal law is totally different. So in the Roman world, something like a battery, somebody hits you, or an assault, or even a theft of your property was not considered a crime. That was considered a delict. Okay, so you had to prosecute that the way we would prosecute, or the way you'd have to go after the offender the way we would sue somebody for a violation that was not considered a crime. So that's kind of surprising. They also didn't have a police force. They also didn't have prosecutors. So today, if somebody hits you, they assault you, and they hit you in the face, the district attorney or whoever is the person who prosecutes crimes in your region, whatever they call them, that person will decide whether or not they want to prosecute that person for violating the law. That's the penal law. That's the criminal law. But that didn't exist in ancient Rome. So it's an entirely different system. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as we go through Jesus's trial before Pilate. So it didn't have to do with the enforcement of the law. Everything, the governor did hear a lot of cases. We'll talk about that too. Now, he also says this: early sources seem to characterize Pilate as nasty and unyielding. I'm not sure what you mean by early sources. This comes up in a lot of critical analysis of the plausibility of the resurrection narratives. Yeah, that's true. We're going to talk about that and the Gospel's portrayal of Pilate, because many people criticize the Gospels by saying that they're not honest or they're not accurate, because the portrayal of Pilate doesn't match what we know about him from history. We'll talk about that. And then Nick continues. This is question number 4. So Nick, wasn't a simple question. I'm curious about the boundaries, explicit or customary, between the authority of the governor and the Sanhedrin. That's a very good question. And something else, which something sort of comes up, I think I might have touched on this briefly. Let's talk about the relationship between the governor and the Sanhedrin. What were the boundaries? Well, the governor has ultimate responsibility for everything that happens in the province. The Sanhedrin was given a lot of leeway and a lot of authority to run Jewish affairs. Okay, so they had the right to do that, and frankly, the Romans preferred it. The Romans preferred it if the Jews handled their own affairs. The Sanhedrin had a tremendous amount of authority over Jews. It's explicit or customary. It's more customary perhaps than explicit, but the Jews did have certain rights under Roman law and custom. And the Romans tried not to interfere with that. And I do discuss this in the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory. And I talk about this. And if you look at some of the episodes, this is in the footnotes, but it's there. If you look at some of the episodes that happened in Acts, where there are followers of Jesus like Paul or like Sosthenes or others who are they're dragged before the Roman authorities, who say you have to by Jews. Jews drag Paul and other early Christians in front of Roman authorities and say you have to stop these people from teaching what they're teaching. And the Romans don't want to get involved because it's a matter of concern only to Jews. It's not a violation of Roman law. Whether or not Jesus is the Messiah has nothing to do with Roman law. Okay, so the Romans don't get involved. And in a couple of instances, they start beating people right in front of the Roman tribune. Okay? They are literally beating Sosthenes or other people right in front. They don't care. They don't stop it. So some people have said, well, the Bible isn't honest because Paul was deputized by the Sanhedrin to go to Damascus and arrest followers of the way. In other words, they are Jewish Christians. The word Christian was unknown. They were just Jews who believed in Jesus. To arrest these people and bring them back, and people say this never would have happened. How could Paul? I'm sorry for I don't know what's going on behind me in the computer that is making all those noises. They say this would never have happened because Paul couldn't go to some other city far away from Jerusalem and arrest people. Yes, he could, because he had the authority of the Sanhedrin. Whatever happened among Jews was a matter of Jewish law, and they had the right to discipline their own. This was something that was widely practiced, and the Romans did not interfere, and the Romans couldn't care less. Okay, so that is true. So did the governor wouldn't step in and handle some matter that was an issue regarding Roman law, just as a prosecutor here in America wouldn't step in and interfere if somebody disagreed with how something was being handled, a matter of discipline within the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or some other religious body. They wouldn't get involved. It has nothing to do with them. Okay, so you have to get out of your head this idea that there was some kind of that the criminal law was something that applied to Jews in a different way, and somehow they had this kind of activity, arresting people, even beating people, was something that wouldn't have been allowed by the Romans because they were a lot like us. The Romans and the way Roman law functioned was nothing like the way our authorities, our civil authorities. You know why? Because we have this very strong line of demarcation. We have this strong separation, as we say, of church and state. So, but for the Jews never saw themselves as just a religion. They are a religion and a nation. And the Romans saw them as a nation. And so they were given a lot of freedom to run their own affairs. Anything that had to do with the Jews, if it had nothing to do with Rome, Rome did not get involved. Okay? So that's kind of a long answer. Next question, number 5 by Nick. This goes to the question of who is responsible for the execution of Jesus. Well, yes. Whether later softened portrayals of Pilate, especially John, reflect a trend to make the Christian movement more directed to Roman acceptance. That's one of the arguments that's made. No. So I do want to address that before we go any further. We're going to talk about Pilate today, but we will continue with elements of the Roman trial and the condemnation of Jesus by Pilate next week. We're never going to cover all of it today, but I do want to say this. One of the arguments that's made against the authenticity, the truthfulness, the veracity of the Gospels is the portrayal of Pilate, that Pilate seems reluctant to put Jesus to death. So this is one of the arguments that is made. Now, that seems that, in other words, we know historically that Pilate was kind of known for his brutality. That is true. Therefore, people conclude the gospel portrayal of Pilate as reluctant to put Jesus to death must not be true and accurate. And I say that's not correct. It is true and accurate, and I'm going to explain to you why Pilate was reluctant to put Jesus to death. So we have to be very careful about drawing conclusions that seem perfectly logical to us just because we have this portrayal of Pilate. You don't know the whole story. This is my point. Okay? So even though people make this argument, there are all other arguments, we could say counter arguments against that. And I think that the portrayal of Pilate is absolutely accurate, of course. If I thought not, then I might say that in the book. I mean, I wouldn't lie to you if I really thought that the gospel sort of softened it. And here's why. The main reason why that argument is made is that the evangelists were trying to curry favor with the Romans. First of all, not just John, all 4 evangelists writing in different places at different times, not colluding together to make the same statement or present Pilate in the same way. They all present the same picture of Pilate. He's not gung-ho for crucifying Jesus. So here again, do you remember way back at the beginning of this series, I talked about verisimilitude. Well, how do we know that the Gospels are historically trustworthy, historically accurate? One of the tests of that is that you have 4 written documents by people that this is called first-generation witnesses, first-generation sources, written by people within the living lifetimes of people who were there. And even though there are 4 of them written by different people in different places at different times, they agree. It would be different if they all said, okay, guys, let's get together. How are we going to portray Pilate? But we know there was no collusion between the gospel writers because they all wrote in different places and with it for a different audience. We don't have one evangelist saying that Pilate really wanted to crucify Jesus, but the other evangelists say, no, he didn't. They're consistent. That consistency by different authors in different places, writing in different times, is very strong evidence of the truthfulness of what they're saying. They didn't all get together and say, let's make the Jews look bad and the Romans look good because we want the Roman Empire to go easy on us. So first of all, that didn't happen. And why wouldn't it have happened? This is the part that nobody ever takes into consideration. How do we know that there was no motivation on the part of the church to cast Pilate in a favorable light? Think of how that seems very logical, and I'm telling you it's very wrong. Why? Because the Romans did not persecute the Christians because they blamed the Romans for the death of Jesus. Do you see what I'm trying to say? How would that help? How would portraying Pilate in a favorable light in the Gospels soften or lessen Roman persecution of Christians? The Romans were not persecuting the Christians because they were presenting the Romans in a bad light in the Gospels. So presenting Pilate in what we would think is a positive light would not make any difference. Romans were persecuting Christians because they refused to worship the Roman gods. And portraying Pilate in one way or the other wouldn't make any difference. It was because the Christians refused to worship the emperor and to worship the Roman gods, and they saw them as atheists and treasonous and all the rest. This is why if you think that the Romans were persecuting the Christians because of the portrayal of Pilate, it has nothing to do with that. You don't know the first thing about Christian history. Can you see my point? All right, that's one thing. So this is not the reason why the Romans were persecuting the Christians, so it wouldn't have made any difference. But I want to give you something else to think about. And this is probably something you never thought of, okay? Because this is the flip side. Always try to think differently. Think differently. Just imagine, try to get out of your own head. Try not to, if you want to understand the Bible, the first thing you have to do is not think like a 21st century American, Canadian, Australian, European, whoever you are, wherever you live. You've got to stop thinking like a Westerner. Okay, this is very logical, so therefore this must be true. You have to think like a person of the first century. And if you want to understand how the Romans would react to the portrayal of Pilate, you have to think with a Roman mind. The Romans probably did not like the portrayal of Pilate, okay? But not because by softening the portrayal of Pilate here, that would not make Romans think more highly about Christians. The Romans probably would not have liked this portrayal of Pilate. Why not? Because they liked it when their governors were tough and hard on criminals. If the Christians wanted to curry favor with the Romans to make Pilate look good in Roman eyes, They would have made Pilate more strict, more tough. They would have made Pilate eager to execute Jesus. Do you see my point? The Romans wouldn't have liked this portrayal of Pilate. Think about it. Can't you see how wrong that idea is? Oh, let's try to make Pilate look like he's not responsible for the death of Jesus. They would have said, we're embarrassed by this governor. They want their governors to be tough and hard-nosed and strict and quickly punish criminals. That's what they expect from a governor. They don't want somebody to be kind and understanding and reluctant. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the portrayal of Pilate by the evangelists is accurate for many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that because they show him reluctant to crucify Jesus, and that is not a quality that Romans would have appreciated in a governor. Do you see how counterintuitive that is? That means it is truthful. Can you see my point? I hope you followed my point there. Okay, the last point that Nick from Rochester brings up is the consequences of this trend would seem to include diminished interest in bringing along Jewish Christians and eventually anti-Semitism. No. I don't think this has anything to do with converting more Jewish Christians. I mean, by the time John writes his gospel, or first of all, no one stops wanting to bring into the faith the Jewish Christian. That was never the case in the church. And there were still many, many Jewish Christians in the church for a long time. So this has nothing to do with trying to make the Romans look good and the Jews look bad. This is certainly not it. And certainly it doesn't lead to anti-Semitism. I don't think so. If it was misunderstood that way, and I think there was a certain misunderstanding or maybe a reluctance to or enthusiasm for blaming the Jews for the death of Jesus. I've already addressed that. That is not the reason why this portrayal was made by John or Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Pilate is reluctant to crucify Jesus for the reasons which we will discuss now as we start to discuss his trial. So I spent a half an hour on this, but at least we got out of our system any idea that perhaps maybe the gospel portrayal of Pilate is not accurate. It is accurate, and you'll find out why after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hi, my name is Tom, and I am from Lafayette, Indiana, and I actually grew up in the Assemblies of God denomination, and now I attend an Episcopal church here in Lafayette. But I just wanted to say that I discovered Ancient Faith Radio maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's just amazing how much talent, production-wise, but all the on-air talent, it's really top-notch, and I enjoy the music and the podcast and the talk call-in shows. Dr. Constantinou is the top 1% academically, how she handles everything on air. Really, I could be probably orthodox. A lot of the beliefs line up to my personal theology. So I just wanted to say it's been just such a blessing. And I just loved being able to have the opportunity to give this week to provide and help the ministry that's going on up there in northern Indiana. And y'all are just outstanding. I want you to know that I'm praying for you all. And thank you very much for all that you do.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Yes, and I forgot to tell you at the start of this program that we have the audible version of the book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, is now available. And I can't thank enough Magister Trudy, who sat with me for hours as I read it out loud and caught some of my mistakes, and also Tim here at Ancient Faith Ministries, who took care of all of the audio, It's a lot of work goes into reading and then editing these audio books and presenting them in the format that's, because there are certain requirements for to appear on Amazon as an audio book. So and they did it so quickly. I mean, I remember with Thinking Orthodox, I think it was a couple months before the audio version came out. So I'm very, very grateful for the speed with which that happened. I know a lot of you like to listen to books because you're engaged in athletics or you have a long commute or other things. So it is now available. I just wanted to pass that on to you. Okay, but it doesn't have the footnotes. There were many times when I wanted to add one of the footnotes in there, but I wasn't allowed to, unfortunately. Okay, so the Roman trial. They led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas. Remember, they had been with him basically all night. It took a long time to convict Jesus because there was a string of witnesses that couldn't agree. Finally, two false witnesses came forward and testified to the same exact thing, and that Jesus had said that he would destroy the temple. And of course, he didn't say that, but Jesus was silent, didn't defend himself. And then because of this prophecy that the Messiah would build a new temple, Jesus would destroy the temple and raise it in 3 days. Because of this prophecy that the Messiah would bring a new temple, the high priest got up and asked Jesus, well, what do you have to say for yourself? And Jesus was silent. He didn't say it that way, but I'm just paraphrasing. And then he asked him directly under oath, under a very special form of oath in which the person was compelled to respond. So Jesus responded and says, he's asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, you said so. And furthermore, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So that last part was blasphemy. Admitting to being the Messiah is not blasphemy. Claiming to be the Messiah is not a crime, and it's not blasphemy. It was identifying himself as the person whom Daniel had seen in his vision, as the Son of Man, as a person at the right hand of God. In other words, it's a claim of divinity. So they knew this, and of course they convict him on the basis of blasphemy. That's the crime. It carries the death penalty. They all agreed, but he was in their custody. They could have stoned him to death. They could have murdered him in any number of ways, but they didn't want to. They wanted him publicly crucified so that he would be discredited in the eyes of the people. So they had to take him to the Romans. It's not just that legally they didn't have the right to kill him. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted the Romans to do it. So they didn't have very far to go. They simply had to go to the Antonia fortress, the Praetorium. So the Praetorium was the place where it was the Roman garrison, but it was also the governor's residence or place where he would stay. And some people have said there were also public places or spaces where a certain business could be attended to. Some people have said that Pilate would not have been in the Antonia fortress, which was on the Temple Mount, but he would have been in one of the palaces of Herod. That no doubt, and of course this is not clear, that's why everybody's debating it. Where is Pilate on Friday morning? I think he was in the Antonia fortress. Other scholars think he was at one of Pilate the Great's residences. In other words, when the Romans took over and Herod the Great died and the area came under the control after Herod's oldest son was removed, the area came under the control of Roman governors. They would have been living in Herod's residence. It's possible, but let's remember this. Pilate is in Judea for one reason. Pilate is in Jerusalem for one reason, to control the massive crowds that would be assembling on the Temple Mount. It was a very dangerous period of the year. Passover was always a time that was full of a lot of religious zeal and emotion. And if ever there was a time that the Jews were going to revolt, it would be at Passover. The Romans knew this very well. And I don't think he would have been in Herod's residence in the upper city. He would have been in the Antonia fortress because that was located on the Temple Mount. Because if there was a riot that was to break out, he couldn't call up his soldiers at the Antonia on his cell phone and advise them what to do, how to put down the revolt. You see what I'm saying? He would not be able to get to the, or would be difficult or dangerous for him to leave if there was a riot or rebellion. He had to be in the Roman garrison. Since it's not, since it's an open question where he was located, because it makes absolutely no sense to me that he would be in a palace some distance away on the opposite side of the city, away from where any trouble might be brewing, and that's the Temple Mount, on that huge courtyard of the Gentiles. That's where the riots would begin. That's where the trouble would start among the crowds. I can't see him being at the palace. He's not there for a vacation. He's there to do a job, and that was to make sure that there would be no rebellion. The Antonia fortress was on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. So if you picture the Temple Mount, it's not round, it's kind of squarish in shape, and it would be on the upper left-hand corner, and it's not at the level of the court of the Gentiles, it's above it. It's located, perched is like a nest above the court of the Gentiles, with a staircase leading down to that courtyard. And from that vantage point up high, they could see everything that was happening on the Temple Mount, and Roman soldiers were constantly watching it. That's where he was. Okay, and the other reason why is because of the trial, what happens at the trial with Barabbas. This is why I think he was there. So normally the governor was in the Roman capital of the province of Judea, which was Caesarea Maritima, a magnificent Roman city built by Herod the Great. Herod the Great had also built the Antonia fortress. He built it and named it for Mark Antony, because Herod the Great had aligned himself with Antony and Cleopatra when there was a civil war going on after the death of Julius Caesar. There was a war going on at the very end of the Roman Republic to see who would take over after Julius Caesar was assassinated. And Herod the Great figured that Mark Antony, who was very strong, a very well-known, very powerful Roman, and Cleopatra, who was queen of Egypt, they couldn't be beaten. That's because he had to figure out who he was going to align himself with. He was already king of Judea. So he aligns himself with Antony and Cleopatra, and of course they lost. So he built this fortress to the Antonia and dedicated it to Mark Antony. But Antony and Cleopatra both died, and it was Augustus Caesar Octavian, who became the first emperor, Augustus Caesar. So now Herod had to try to save his throne because he backed the wrong side. But guess what? He did. He went to Rome. He met with Augustus Caesar, and he managed, shows you the shrewdness and the political abilities of Herod the Great, that he managed to keep his kingdom, remain as this vassal king of Rome, and in gratitude to Augustus Caesar, built the Roman capital. And it is really, truly one of the wonders of the world, because it does not have a natural seaport. I think I've talked about this to you once before, but Caesarea Maritima is built on a sandy seashore, and they created an artificial harbor in order to create this beautiful Roman city. And he named it, of course, after Augustus Caesar, called it Caesarea, but it's Caesarea by the sea, Caesarea Maritima. That's where St. Paul was in prison for 2 years. That was the place where all the public administrative buildings were. That was the governor's residence. So Pilate just happens to be in Jerusalem for a short period of time to keep watch over the city, because this is a very dangerous time. Passover is a dangerous time because of the large crowds of very enthusiastic, very religious Jews who were gathering in one place. So he is in the Roman garrison. Now let's talk about the way the Romans administered justice in the empire. In the city of Rome, most of the laws that we know about and courts and procedures that we know about from Roman sources happen in the city of Rome. And that was very different in the provinces. So Nick was right to the extent that the Roman governor had a lot of flexibility, a lot of authority in the provinces to administer justice as he saw fit. But it's not just, Rome didn't just have the city of Rome and provinces. The Roman Empire encompassed a lot of different forms of government and administration, and how each of those forms operated depended upon what it was. So you had at one time Herod the Great. This whole area was run by a king. At this time, concurrently in the time of Christ, at the very moment that he's being brought before Pilate, he is a citizen of a different kingdom. He's a citizen of the kingdom of Galilee. Galilee has a king. It's Herod Antipas. So that is an independent kingdom. It's independent to a certain degree. It's under the umbrella of Rome. They had to cooperate with Rome. They had to do what Rome said ultimately. But that wasn't a kingdom, and it wasn't the only one. There were many kingdoms under the umbrella of the Roman Empire that were managed by these client kings or satellite kings or puppet kings who did the bidding of Rome. There were also colonies. Roman colonies had their own laws and their own procedures, and they operated basically independently. There were also free cities. The Decapolis is a region that has 10 free Greek cities, but there were other cities that were also, when I say free, that means they were like a little city state. They ran their own affairs. They had their own courts. They took care of themselves. They managed themselves. Ultimately, they had to answer to Rome. They had to pay the Roman taxes and other things, but they ran themselves independently. So how a province was managed was different from how a free city was managed, how a kingdom was managed, how a colony was managed. It was very complicated, okay? So we're talking here only about the administration of law in a province. So a province, and of course, among the Jews and probably among other ethnic groups, they had the right to have their own courts and their own laws and to enforce those laws and to administer punishment as long as it wasn't the death penalty. This is why St. Paul is punished by the Jews in various parts of the Roman Empire. St. Paul says, he tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, when he describes his sufferings as an apostle, he starts out by saying, 5 times I received 39 lashes minus 1, 40 lashes minus 1. That's 39 lashes. That is not from the Romans. By the Jews, 5 times I received 39 lashes by the Jews. The Jews were punishing Paul for preaching about Jesus Christ. It's not the Romans who are punishing Paul. The Romans don't care what Paul is doing. It's the Jews who are objecting to what Paul is saying and doing. And then he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Stoning is not a Roman punishment. That's a Jewish punishment. So Paul was being disciplined by people in synagogues that he visited who were so offended by his message about Jesus Christ that they took it upon themselves to punish him according to Jewish law. And the Romans did not interfere with that. So you have to understand that you cannot assume that the way law and order was carried out is carried out today in modern societies bears any resemblance to what happened in the first century Roman Empire. The Jews had the right under Roman law to discipline their own members, and they did it. And even though it was against Roman law to kill anybody, the fact that Paul was stoned, and that's not a punishment, that's a death sentence, meant that they were willing to stone him to death. And I don't know why anybody would be surprised at that. Stephen was stoned to death, and people say to me, well, how did that happen? How was it that St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, was stoned to death? Wasn't that against the law? Of course it was against the Roman law. The Romans said you can do whatever you want to discipline people, but you can't stone that. You can't put anybody to death. Well, then how come they did it? Well, guess what? People murder people all the time. It's against the law in California. It's against the law in China. It's against the law all over the world to kill somebody. But people do it, right? So we have to be realistic about these things. Okay, so there were lots of different types of jurisdiction. One of the main responsibilities of a Roman governor was to administer justice. And this occupied a lot of his time and attention. Now, this is why they would be very happy if the Jews would run their affairs and handle their own problems. The Pilate had enough to do without having to listen to little, squabbles or, try every case. He didn't try every case. The Jews not only had the great Sanhedrin that heard certain very important cases, they had lesser Sanhedrins of 23, and they had tribunals. I told you about this last time, of 3. So in every village, in every town, there was a court system. If you were a Jew, you had a grievance against another Jew, you went to your local court. You didn't go to the Romans. You certainly wouldn't want to go to Pilate. So in the province literally means provincia, the sphere of action of a magistrate. So one of the main jobs that a governor had was to administer justice, to maintain law and order. And law and order is the main thing that a Roman governor was called to do. Keep law and order, keep everybody behaving, paying their taxes, and not rebelling. And as part of that, of course, they had to hear cases. They didn't have a Roman court system in the provinces. They had a court system in Rome. Okay, the court system was completely different from what we had. There were specific courts that heard specific crimes. All right, but here, when a governor came to a province, he came with the authority of the emperor, and that was called the imperium. The imperium was the authority of the emperor to act within that specific geographic area for the period of his tenure, and that was 2 years. So Roman governors served for 2 years unless they wanted their stay extended. Pilate spent 12 years in Judea. That's a very long time. Very long time. And this meant that he was doing a good job because the Romans didn't remove him. So he was keeping law and order. And also, it was benefiting him. There's a reason why a man like Pilate, who was not quite nobility, a step below the Roman nobility, he was an equestrian. So he's definitely of the upper classes, but not of the senatorial rank. He was an equestrian. This is how you became rich. That's why somebody like Pilate would go to a place like Judea to, first of all, curry favor and make a name for himself with the emperor, and also to become rich. And how did you become rich? By taking bribes for certain positions like tax collectors. And there were lots of positions to be filled, tax collectors and toll collectors and high priests and all kinds of other things, and Roman positions too. So he has almost the unfettered right to do whatever he thought was right in the province. He was given a lot of authority. The imperium, it is as though the emperor himself is there acting through the governor. He couldn't abuse his power, and technically they weren't supposed to receive bribes. There were laws against that, but of course, those laws were frequently broken. So he heard criminal cases, he heard ordinary civil cases. Now, what you don't know about the civil law, which I sort of started to tell you, is that you don't, there were no prosecutors. So that meant that if somebody believed that somebody had stolen something, for example, I finished telling you earlier that a theft or, if somebody attacked you and beat you, you could sue them, but because it wasn't a crime. Your only redress was to sue them, sort of what we would say civilly. That's a delict. You had to bring them before the court. You couldn't put them in jail, for example. You couldn't do that because it's not a crime. So what would you do? There was no prosecutor. You had to go get your friends and arrest this person. You literally had to get a posse of people, a group of people, find out where they were, who they were, where they lived, go and physically arrest them, drag them before the governor, and you yourself, the victim, had to prosecute the case. Maybe if you were wealthy, you might hire an orator. Okay. Or if you were a defendant, you might hire an orator to plead your case, because people did prize oration, as in speech making. But mostly people prosecuted the case themselves. And this is exactly what we see here. This is exactly what the Sanhedrin does. They arrested Jesus, they brought him before Pilate, and they are making the case against him. See what I'm saying? That's exactly how it worked. But not just with the Sanhedrin or Jesus, but in every kind of case in which the governor was asked to adjudicate. You as a private individual had to arrest the person and bring them and make your case and hope that the governor sees it your way. That's how it worked, okay? So the only thing that the governor could not do, and first of all, the only thing a governor could not do was summarily execute a citizen, a Roman citizen. A Roman citizen had the right to a trial, and the Roman citizen had a right to appeal to Caesar. But other than that, the kind of justice that you would receive would depend upon who you were. Okay? So even though people talk about how great Rome was and its judicial system, it was extremely corrupt, and it certainly justice was not blind. If you were poor, you were treated much more harshly than if you were rich. And you were more likely to be considered guilty if you were poor than if you were rich, okay? So the Romans definitely had a different classes of we could say punishment, different types of punishment. Punishment was more severe if you were poor than if you were rich also. So Pilate is in Jerusalem, and they bring Jesus before him at the Antonia fortress very early in the morning. It could have been as early as 6 a.m. That's when the Roman workday began. They liked to work from about daybreak until about noon, and then they had the rest of the day off. What do you think about that? Would you like to work from 6 a.m. to noon every day? It has its points, doesn't it? But remember that the Sanhedrin was up all night with Jesus. They finally decided he deserves to die. Basically, they walk him from Caiaphas's house in the upper city through the city in the wee hours of the morning, probably while it's still dark. They arrive at the Antonia fortress, and they want to see Pilate, and they know that he's going to be at work very, very, very early in the morning. And that suits them very well, because they can have Jesus convicted and condemned and headed for the cross before anybody else in the city understands or knows what has happened. We don't know who knows what's going on. We don't even know. I mean, certainly Peter and John were at Caiaphas's residence, and they know what happened, but nobody else really knows what happens. Remember, Jesus is very, very popular, and the Jewish leaders want him condemned and on the way to the cross before everybody wakes up in the city and finds out what happened. Okay? So this is a reality. So you have to understand what was at stake here. They want him dead, and they want him eliminated quietly, but also crucified publicly to disgrace him and discredit him. So they're hoping that Pilate will rubber stamp this whole thing. Okay, they brought you. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. Why do they think that Pilate's going to rubber stamp this? Because Pilate did have a reputation for brutally putting down dissent. Absolutely, that is true. As I mentioned, he had 5 consecutive 2-year terms. He is known for his brutality, and he was recalled to Rome on charges of extreme brutality. He put a lot of Samaritans to death, apparently without a good reason. And he was on his way to Rome to be tried by the Senate for this. So I have more details in the book about how we know about his brutality and the things that he did. It's quite fascinating. Now, here's what happened according to John. Now, in all 4 Gospels talk about Jesus' appearance before Pilate, but John's description is much more extensive. And John tells us that they brought Jesus there very early in the morning, and that they would not enter the house under the roof of Pilate into the Antonia fortress. This is a very high-level delegation from the Sanhedrin, and Pilate knows these people. They've worked with Pilate before. He's been there for a long time. He knows them very well. Pilate, by the way, was governor of Judea from 26 to 36, and Jesus was executed in the year 33. And I'm telling you this not because that's the traditional year that we say that Jesus died, but because there are reasons why we know that that's the year that Jesus died. It's the actual year, going back and counting. So Pilate has been there already from 26 to 33. He's been there for 7 years. That's a pretty long time for a governor to be in one particular province, and he's very familiar with these people, and he works in close coordination with the Jewish aristocracy and the Sanhedrin to keep the peace. That's his main goal, and that's their goal too. Why is it their goal? They don't want to disrupt Roman order. The Jewish aristocracy, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, and the chief priest, they're the ones who are primarily responsible for the death of Jesus because of the threat to order that he poses. Any threat to order means it's a threat to their position, their power, and their wealth. They are wealthy and powerful because they cooperate with Rome. And that's the threat that Jesus poses. Now, Jesus is not a rabble-rouser. He is not a zealot. He's not interested in political position, but they don't know that. All they know is that Jesus has a lot of followers. He's very powerful with his signs. The people regard him as a king, not as a king, as a potential king. They regard him as a prophet and a Messiah because he was just welcomed into the city with shouts of, "Hosanna, Son of David, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." And by the way, blessed is the one who comes. The one who comes was a messianic title. We think when we hear that, blessed is the one who comes, is because Jesus is coming along the road riding a donkey. No, the coming one, or the one who comes, is a messianic title. Because for centuries, the Jews were waiting for the one who would come. So even though he's standing right there in front of them, Martha says, "Yes, Lord, I believe you are the one who is coming into the world." Okay, even though Lazarus died, Martha, his sister, says, "I believe you are the one who is coming into the world." Did you ever wonder why she says that? He's right in front of her. She's not talking about him coming in the future. She's saying that she's addressing him by a messianic title. So this is what has given the chief priests, the high priests, and the Sanhedrin a cause for alarm. And so this is why they want to eliminate him, because they believe that he's a real threat to their power. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we will talk about why Pilate isn't, whether or not Pilate has any knowledge of Jesus. That's what we'll talk about when we come back. Prior knowledge of Jesus. Join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so I mentioned Pilate was a very brutal guy. You don't survive for 12 years as governor of Judea by being a nice teddy bear, okay? That's not what he was. There's no question about that. All of the sources, we're talking about Josephus, Philo, other people talk about, and Pilate, we know that he was pretty, very, very strict and did not hesitate to, with a lot of violence and force, put down any kind of Jewish any protests against him or anything that he was doing. So he was very well known for that. So why is he reluctant to execute Jesus? This is our question. So Pilate comes out. John tells us that Jesus is brought to the praetorium. Pilate comes outside to meet with the Jewish leaders. And what does he say to them? What accusation do you bring against this man? Now, some people, including some Bible scholars, say, well, the Romans must have known about Jesus. Jesus is a threat to Rome. They must have known, must have known, must have known. Where do you get that idea from the Gospels? From the Gospels, it's quite obvious that Pilate has never heard of Jesus before. He's not a threat to Rome. He doesn't see Jesus as a threat. This would have been an entirely different case if Pilate considered Jesus a threat. But Pilate has never heard of Jesus, and people find that impossible to believe. Oh, Jesus was doing all these miracles, and, he must have heard about Jesus. Why? Now, Herod has heard about Jesus, Herod Antipas, the king in Galilee, because Jesus was traveling a lot in Galilee. Herod is Jewish. He's a Jewish king. So he knows about it. Why would anybody tell Pilate about Jesus? I just want you to think about this. Remember that question about whether or not we should pay taxes? Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? Rabbi, tell us if it's lawful. How this was a trap for Jesus. Remember that? Why was that a trap? Because they were looking for some reason to report about Jesus to Pilate. If Pilate heard that there was someone who was undermining Roman authority, they would have been the first. They had no reason. They would have been the first to run to Pilate and tell him about Jesus. That's why they set it up that way. Not just so that Jesus would be arrested, for encouraging non-payment of taxes, but without that, they have absolutely nothing to say to Pilate without it being something of a political nature. And Jesus never talked politics. And not only that, Jesus was doing a lot of activities, and a lot of his preaching was in Galilee, or he was on the other side of the Jordan, or he was in the temple. He was in the synagogues. Where were Romans ever going to hear about Jesus? And when Jesus was preaching, what was he preaching in? Greek? In Latin? Of course not. The Romans wouldn't have been speaking Latin. That was one of the big, big mistakes of the Passion of the Christ movie. There were so many historical mistakes in that, but one of them was this conversation between Jesus and Pilate in Latin. Not that Jesus couldn't have spoken Latin if he wanted to, but everybody would have been speaking Greek, not Latin. So Pilate had no reason to have Jesus's existence and activities brought to his attention. Nobody would say, hey, Pilate, you should know about this rabbi who's going around preaching. Pilate has a lot of things on his mind. The last thing he needs to know about is some Jewish rabbi, as long as he was behaving himself. Now, Pilate did put to death, and other Roman governors very quickly put to death and destroy the movements of people who were actually rebelling against Rome. And some of those people are mentioned even in the New Testament, and they're mentioned by Flavius Josephus and other early first century writers, okay? So there are people actually mentioned in, as I said, in the book of Acts. So Jesus, however, was not anything like those. So this is the first reason why it's ridiculous to suggest that just because Pilate and other governors forcefully and violently and quickly put an end to movements of rebellion, people who were trying to rally their fellow Jews against the Romans, those people, yes, they quickly put down those rebellions, quickly, forcefully, violently put them all to death. And not just the leader, but all of their followers. Yes, because those people were encouraging rebellion against Rome. But Jesus was not. And proof that he was not is in the fact that Pilate has never heard of him. And believe me, if Jesus had said the slightest thing against Rome, all of his enemies among the Jews would have run to Pilate to say, you should know about this rabbi who's telling people not to pay taxes or some other things, speaking against Caesar or anything else. So Jesus's ministry bears no resemblance to those other people who were fomenting rebellions against Rome. So Pilate did not know about Jesus and therefore would not have considered Jesus a threat automatically. Now, if he had heard about Jesus and these things, then he would have said, oh, I'm glad you brought Jesus before me. Let's put him to death before he creates a problem for us. So just because Jesus is famous today, don't assume that Pilate would have known of him. And by the way, this is also one of the arguments that people say, well, if Jesus really did all those miracles, how come everybody didn't know about him? Why weren't Roman historians going there to report about Jesus? Because he's Jewish and living in Judea, and they either wouldn't have believed the stories of Jesus, or they would have said, so what? He's another God? We've got our own gods who do miracles. You see, the things that seem very logical to us today would not have been logical to people back then. Nobody would have said, oh, bring some Roman historian here to document what Jesus is doing, because, hundreds of years later, Jesus is very well known. That's ridiculous. The fact that there are no Roman historians who talk about Jesus as a wonder worker and nobody ran from Rome to find out about this wonder worker, first of all, he had a very short ministry anyhow. Okay? He wasn't around a long time. But the Roman historians and Jewish historians do talk about Jesus as a wonder worker, but mostly he's known for being crucified. So anyhow, some things that seem very logical to us are very illogical if you know the slightest thing about how people lived and what they believed and how they thought in those days. So some preaching rabbi would not attract Pilate's notice. Gentiles never came to hear Jesus preach. Jesus was a sensation in Jewish circles, not in Roman circles. Jesus didn't preach in Greek. He preached in Aramaic to his own people. And that nothing that he did would have alarmed the Romans or had any reason to bring him to his attention, okay? So Pilate doesn't know who Jesus is. So what does he say? Why have you brought this man before me? What accusation do you bring against this man? This is what Pilate asks the members of the Sanhedrin. And what do they say? Just listen to the response. If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over. That's John 18:29-30. If he were not an evildoer, if he wasn't a bad guy, we wouldn't have brought him to you. What has this man done is what Pilate asked. And what did they say? He's a bad guy. Otherwise, he's an evildoer. We wouldn't have brought him before you if he wasn't. So what is Pilate's response? Take him away and judge him according to your own law. Did you see that? They had the right to judge him according to their own law. What the Pilate doesn't know is that they've already done that. They think Jesus deserves to die. But what's the point? Did you notice what they said? If he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him. They did not mention a Roman crime. They didn't say this man has done this, which is a crime. They said he's an evildoer. Well, guess what? You know what? You can't convict somebody of being an evildoer in the state of California either. You can't level a charge against someone anywhere that I know of in the world where there's a charge. He's an evildoer. You have to specify a crime. He assaulted someone. He stole something. Even that Pilate would have said, hey, handle it yourselves. Do you see my point? You have to, they had to present a case that Jesus violated Roman law, not that he deserved to die under Jewish law, because Pilate has no authority. In the realm of Jewish law, Pilate can only try someone for a violation of Roman law. You see my point? So Pilate says right away, Pilate recognizes there is no crime here. So people say, well, Pilate would never have been reluctant to crucify somebody. Yes, he would. I mean, Pilate, even though he was very tough with rebellion, he's not going to take the time to put somebody on trial when they haven't even alleged a Roman crime. He's a busy man, and this is a very, very busy day. It's the day before Passover. He has to make sure they're going to be ready to answer any threat of rebellion. He doesn't want to be bothered with this first thing in the morning. He's not going to put somebody on trial when the people who brought you, what charge? What's the charge? It has to be a Roman crime. He recognizes immediately that this is a religious dispute. He's an evildoer. Well, guess what? That's not a crime under Roman law. You have to allege a crime under Roman law. That's why when you get pulled over by the police, on your ticket, it says exactly what crime you violated under the traffic code. What offense are you being charged with violating of the traffic code? Speeding, it's section, I don't know what, 565.1A. You exceeded the legal limit. It's going to say that on your ticket, or you passed a red light or something like this. They have to, you can't just say we didn't like the way you were driving. You have to allege a violation of a specified law. Pilate had to they had to allege a crime against Jesus according to Roman law, and evildoer isn't it, okay? So right off the bat, Pilate knows that they're not bringing somebody to him that has actually committed a crime. And I don't care who you are, even though Pilate is very, very tough on crime when somebody actually revolts against Rome, I don't think that most people would willingly or speedily or happily or enthusiastically convict someone and sentence them to crucifixion if they hadn't done anything wrong. And from the get-go, Pilate knows this, that they have not proven any case. They haven't even leveled a charge against Jesus. That's a violation of Roman law. And it's quite surprising when you think about it. They are completely unprepared to prosecute a case against Jesus. They haven't stated a crime. Now, they believe he deserves to die, but they have to find a crime under Roman law that allows Pilate to sentence him to death. And being an evildoer is just not it. So Pilate is really annoyed. He's a very busy man. He says, take him away and judge him according to your law. Okay, so now Jesus is brought inside the praetorium, and they stay outside. So Jesus goes inside, and they are outside. And we don't know what they said to him outside. John doesn't tell us. But when did we do? We don't hear the exact conversation, but we know from what Pilate says when he re-enters the praetorium. This is like a two-stage scene. Jewish leaders are outside the praetorium because they don't want to be defiled. If they enter under the roof of a Roman, they will not be able to participate in the Passover. They want to be able to participate in the Passover. And by the way, a lot of these people are chief priests. They have duties to perform at the temple. So they can't become ritually defiled by entering under the roof of Pilate. So they could on some other day maybe, because they would have time to ritually cleanse themselves and that sort of thing. But right now it's the day of preparation. Passover is going to begin in less than 12 hours. So they can't enter into the roof. So Pilate's questioning of Jesus is outside of their earshot, and Pilate's conversation with them is outside of Jesus' earshot. Jesus is inside praetorium. Jewish leaders are outside. So we can surmise what they said to Pilate, because when he re-enters the praetorium, he says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" So notice what happened. Outside the praetorium, the Jewish leaders start telling Pilate that Jesus was welcomed into Jerusalem by a big crowd that shouted, Hosanna, Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. So they have changed the charge. They realize that they made a mistake by suggesting that this was a religious crime. They have to give Pilate a crime under Roman law and a crime that carries the death penalty, and that is treason. So they must have told him, Pilate, that Jesus claimed to be king. So he enters a praetorium and says, Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And he says, my kingdom is not of this world, right? And so he has a little discussion with Pilate about this. And the way the whole thing is, notice that there's no jury here. Pilate is doing the questioning, and the chief priests are the accusers. And Jesus has the right to have people to testify for his own behalf. He has a right to self-defense in this type of thing. But this is, at its heart, an inquisitorial system. The Roman governor would proceed by inquisition. In other words, they would call that coercitio. Cognitio. Cognitio is that the governor, the person who was the judge, is also the person asking the questions. So Pilate is questioning Jesus, and then he's going back and conversing and listening to what his accusers are saying. Those are the chief priests. And then he goes back inside and has a discussion with Jesus. Now, Pilate has done this hundreds of times. Pilate has been already governor of Judea for 7 years. And as I said, one of the chief occupations of a Roman governor was hearing cases. He's a very experienced. He knows what kinds of questions to ask. He can tell when somebody is telling the truth and when someone is lying. And Jesus is not like any other defendant who has ever appeared before him. So yes, he has a lot, because he's operating according to cognitio, that's inquisition. He asks the questions. He's both the prosecutor, or not really the prosecutor, the examiner and the judge. He has a lot of leeway. Jesus would have been treated as a very low class person, a foreigner, even though he's a Jew in the area of Judea. Nonetheless, he would have been considered a foreigner and not been accorded some consideration, but not a lot, because he's not wealthy. And the treatment you received in the justice system depended upon your status and your wealth, okay? But Pilate does question him. That was his job. So he says, are you a king? Are you the king of the Jews? And it seems like it is a ridiculous question, because here is Jesus standing there in ordinary clothes. And what does Jesus say? This is very important. We don't think about this. Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it to you about me? Did you hear this from someone else? Or are you asking me if I'm a king? Now, why does Jesus say this? Is Jesus trying to find out Pilate's source of information? Of course not. What he's trying to point out to Pilate is that Pilate had never heard of Jesus before that moment. Jesus is being accused of claiming to be king by the Jewish leaders. But if that were true, Pilate would have heard about Jesus long before. So he says, have others told you that about me? And the answer is yes. And Pilate knows that. The first thing he's ever heard about Jesus claiming to be king is from these Jewish leaders who are, as he just heard it 5 minutes ago, okay, who are standing outside. So Pilate says, and look again how Pilate has never heard of Jesus before. So Pilate does not know Jesus. He says, am I a Jew? In other words, I don't know anything about you. Am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? That's what Pilate says to Jesus. What have you done? Your nation, they handed you over to me. What have you done? In other words, I've never heard of you. He's giving Jesus an opportunity that was part of Roman law. You have the right to defend yourself. So he's giving Jesus an opportunity to say his side, to defend himself. But notice that here again, this simply reinforces the fact that Jesus had not committed any crime. He had not come to the attention of the Romans. So even though it seems, quote, logical, unquote, to us that Jesus would have been known to the Roman authorities, he clearly is not. So Pilate is doing what he's supposed to do as the governor is questioning Jesus to find out more about him and who is he going to believe. So Jesus has demonstrated that there is no evidence against him. Jesus is not rebellious. He never claimed to be king. And Pilate's response proves that Jesus is right. Okay? By the way, this also proves that the Romans were not involved in arresting Jesus. Because if they were, Pilate would know who Jesus is. If Jesus was really a threat, then Pilate would have sent the Roman soldiers squad to arrest Jesus, and he doesn't. Okay, so that didn't happen. So now in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they say, Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You have said so." Okay, but Jesus says that his kingship is not of this world, right? So Pilate recognizes that Jesus is not a threat. He says, "Yes, I'm a king, but you say I'm a king, but I was born to bear witness to the truth." And Pilate says, "What is truth?" You can see how he's a little annoyed that this issue was brought before him. This is a very, very busy day. It's the eve of Passover. This is the most dangerous time of year for Roman soldiers. There will be probably close to 150,000 or 200,000 Jews assembling on the Temple Mount in a few hours. And they have things to do. He does not want to be bothered trying someone who really is not a threat, because if Jesus were a threat, believe me, Pilate would have heard about it. He would have heard about it, first of all, from all of these Jewish leaders who've been trying to get rid of Jesus for 3 years now. Okay? Even if the Romans didn't hear about it, the Jews who have been opposing Jesus all this time, they would have told Pilate about him. So we have that issue. He knows that he's never heard of Jesus because Jesus is not a threat, number one. Number two, Jesus is showing his innocence because he shows no signs of guilt. Jesus is not behaving like anyone who's worried. Pilate is accustomed to people who are accused of treason or anything else being brought before him, begging for their lives, nervous, afraid. Okay? There is absolutely no evidence that Jesus is treasonous, claiming to be a king. The only people who are saying that are these accusers, and Pilate just heard about it a few minutes ago. So Pilate looking at Jesus, his demeanor, Pilate is questioning Jesus. Jesus is calm. He's not even trying very hard to defend himself. He's in complete control. He's not begging for mercy. He's not offering Pilate a bribe. And Pilate does not think, evaluating all of this, that Jesus has committed any kind of crime. He just heard about it. There's no evidence of it. The chief priests haven't brought anybody to testify that Jesus claimed to be a king or is encouraging people to revolt against Rome. Pilate doesn't want to bother with this right now. Jesus doesn't look like he's guilty. He's talking about a kingdom, of truth. He's talking about bearing witness to the truth, that his kingdom is not of this world. That's good enough. Pilate knows that Jesus is not guilty of anything. It's very obvious by the demeanor of Jesus, by the fact that there are no witnesses, and he has never heard of Jesus before. So the next thing that happens that further makes Pilate reluctant to get involved, here again, Pilate doesn't want to be bothered with this. But a lot of people would say, yeah, but he was so brutal. He was so quick to punish anyone who rebelled against Rome. Yes, anyone who rebelled against Rome. But would he, as a reasonable human being, and he had to have been, we know other cases where he shows that he's very reasonable, would he have put someone to death that he actually believed was not guilty of any crime? I don't think so. He'd have to be a monster to do that. And there's nothing that suggests that he was that irrational, that he would have put someone to death whom he really believed had not committed any kind of crime. He would have to answer to that too, you know. He wasn't sent to Judea just to kill people. He was sent to Judea to maintain law and order. And part of that meant figuring out who was innocent and letting them go and who was guilty and punishing that person. So he also, remember that the Romans also prided themselves on justice. So if he truly believed that Jesus was not guilty of a crime, it was the right thing to do under Roman law to release him. All right? He has another reason not to get involved with Jesus, and that's because his wife had a dream. And the name of Pilate's wife is Procla or Procla Claudia, that has come down to us from tradition, that she said, don't get involved with this man. I've had a dream and I've suffered much in a dream, according to him. That's redactional to Matthew. That story is found only in the Gospel of Matthew. But all along, Pilate's a little bit reluctant to get involved in the matter concerning Jesus. And so he's quite hesitant. He's dragging his feet. Now, next week, we'll talk about how it is that here, when he really is convinced that Jesus is not guilty, how it comes about that the chief priests and other members of the Sanhedrin succeed in getting Pilate to put Jesus to death. It's really fascinating. They manipulate Pilate in a way that will probably surprise you. So Pilate's wife has had a dream. She doesn't want him to get involved with this. She is, by tradition, a saint of the Orthodox Church. And Pilate, however, does not. He's a saint in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but we don't really know what happened with Pilate. That's probably why he's not a saint for the other Orthodox. Only in the Ethiopians, they have a tradition that he became a Christian, but not the rest. As a matter of fact, we don't exactly know how Pilate's life ended, but we do know that he spent 10 years in Judea as a governor and was recalled to Rome on charges of cruelty. But while he was traveling to Rome to defend himself against charges of cruelty for killing all these Samaritans, Tiberius Caesar died. So he never had to face charges. And Caligula, Gaius Caligula, becomes the next emperor. He could have prosecuted Pilate, or at least tried him. But really, the Roman Senate, which is the body that before whom Pilate would have appeared if he had actually stood trial for killing a large number of Samaritans, they would have, we're not sure that they would have found him guilty, because the Roman Senate knew that the job that was done by these provincial governors was very difficult, and they gave them wide latitude to administer justice and to punish at times very harshly. You know, we think, well, why would somebody just put someone to death? You know, this was how life was. So Pilate, he killed a lot of Samaritans on a charge of rebellion, and we might think that that's brutal, and it was. But that was life in the Roman Empire. Life was short, life was hard, life was brutal, and there was a lot of violence. So it wouldn't have been so out of the ordinary for a Roman governor to kill a lot of people, and it's questionable whether he would have been convicted at a hearing before the Senate of Rome. But he never did have to stand trial. And after that, we don't know what happened to him. There were legends later, there were legends about Pilate. There were really three main legends. One was that he committed suicide by jumping into the Tiber River, or that he was exiled. But probably none of those are true, because we don't have any early traditions about what happened to Pilate. Probably nothing bad happened to him. Those legends that he committed suicide or was exiled, those come about much later. There was a pagan author, his name was Celsus or Celsus, and he wrote a book against the Christian faith, and he was trying to undermine Christianity. This was in like the 2nd century. And he said Jesus was not God. Origen, the great 3rd century Christian writer and thinker, 3rd century meaning the 200s, remember, he came along and he wrote a very, very famous work called Contra Celsum, against Celsus. And he defended the Christian faith, but he never responds to this argument that Celsus made. If Jesus was really a god, Pilate would have suffered some horrible fate because he sentenced a god to death. That was one of Celsus's arguments, that Jesus could not have been God because, according to Roman tradition, if you did something bad to a god, you always met some horrible punishment. So that was his argument, that nothing bad happened to Pilate. So Jesus must not have been a god. Now, Origen responds to Pilate by writing this famous work called Contra Celsum, against Celsus. And Origen never says what happened to Pilate. So Origen would have been writing like around the year 230. Early enough, by the way, when there were still oral traditions about the Lord being passed along. So what became of Pilate, we don't know, but probably it wasn't something bad like suicide or exile. Otherwise, Origen would have responded and said, oh, yes, he is a god because he committed suicide, or he was sentenced to exile, or something terrible happened to him. The fact that Origen is silent and he responds to Celsus point by point by point, responding to Celsus's arguments against the Christian faith, the fact that Origen doesn't explain what happened to Pilate and that something bad happened kind of suggests that Pilate just basically retired from public life, or had a quiet life, or maybe he took the money he got from his bribes and bought a nice estate there someplace in Italy. We don't really know what happened to Pilate. That's my answer. I wish I could have something more definitive, but we do not know. So our time has come to an end. Now, next week, we're going to find about, we're not even done with Pilate. We have a lot to talk about because Pilate really doesn't want to deal with this issue of Jesus. He's very annoyed by the fact that the Jewish leaders have brought this problem into his lap. It's the last day that he would want to be hearing a trial, hearing a case. He's very, very busy. So one of the things he tries to do is to pacify them by having Jesus scourged. We're going to talk about scourging next time. And we're going to talk about how the Romans mocked Jesus, what that was like and why they did it, and how Jesus ends up getting sentenced to death, even though Pilate still does not believe he's guilty of anything. There's something very specific that happens that leads to the Jewish leaders basically forcing Pilate to crucify Jesus, but you'll have to wait till next week to find out what that is. So now let us close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people, Israel. Good night. God bless.